Every conflict has a moment where it stops being what it looked like at the beginning, and this is that moment for the war with Iran. For weeks, the coverage was about missiles, interceptors, air defenses, the usual parade of hardware and explosions. But the confrontation just crossed into something far more dangerous, and most of the world barely noticed. Here's the part that matters. Iran just made a move that many still do not fully understand. A decision that handed the United States military exactly what it had been waiting for since before the first strike was launched. Not a battlefield advantage, something better, a justification, and once you see it, the entire war rearranges itself in your mind. So let's start with the question nobody in the headlines is asking. When does a war stop being about who can launch the bigger missile and turn into a struggle over who controls the arteries that keep a country alive? That shift happened in plain sight. And the move that triggered it was made by Iran itself. During the early months of this conflict, both sides settled into a rhythm most observers could predict. Iran would make a provocative move near the Strait of Hormuz. The United States would answer by striking air defense sites, radar positions, and naval assets. Strike, retaliation, pause. Even the casualty levels seemed managed, as if both sides were quietly avoiding a true breaking point. Blow for blow. A pattern. The kind of confrontation that looks intense in real time but actually operates inside unwritten limits that both sides recognize without ever declaring them. Then, the target list changed, and when you understand how it changed, you understand the whole war. Accounts from southern Iran describe strikes hitting a series of bridges in Hormozgan province. These were not decorative overpasses or minor crossings. Local authorities confirmed multiple major structures damaged, including at least one that was still under construction. Near Bandar Abbas, one of Iran's busiest commercial ports, a key rail junction linking the port's freight traffic to the national rail grid was attacked and disrupted. And the deep water installation that serves that port lost something it cannot function without: its central control tower. Reports indicate the tower is now gone. Sit with that for a second. This is not one isolated objective. This is not random collateral from a precision strike gone wrong. This is a coordinated campaign against the physical veins and arteries that let a state function. Remove the bridges, the rail spurs, the port facilities that carry fuel, cargo, people, and military hardware across the country, and you're no longer just hitting an armed force. You are immobilizing an entire society. And the strikes did not stop there. Iranian officials stated that U.S. operations also damaged a water pumping site supplying the Bandar Abbas area. Transmission lines carrying electricity to the city and the surrounding regions went dark. Local outlets described turmoil in transport systems, as damaged rail infrastructure triggered a chain reaction that brought freight and shipping movements to a standstill. Iran's own energy ministry, confronted with mounting strain on a battered power grid, publicly appealed to citizens to cut back electricity use in peak summer heat. Consider what that means. A government telling its own people to turn off their air conditioners in the middle of summer because of a war it either started or is now trapped in, depending on whose narrative you accept. That is not a story about battlefield triumph. That is a story about a society beginning to crack under cumulative pressure, and the fallout did not stay inside Iran's borders. During Iranian counterstrikes, one of Kuwait's power and desalination plants sustained damage. That matters more than most people realize, because tens of millions of people across the Gulf depend on desalinated seawater for their daily drinking supply. Many of those plants sit squarely within range of weapons already in active use. One misjudged attack, one hit on the wrong plant in the wrong place, and you could trigger humanitarian emergencies in several states at once. Now we reach the question that separates shallow commentary from real comprehension. Why would a military strategist pivot from destroying enemy weapons to destroying bridges, grids, and ports? The answer exposes something about modern warfare that almost nobody considers. At the start of a conflict, planners focus on what can hurt them immediately. A missile launcher that could fire today, a radar that is tracking aircraft right now, a ship that could strike a tanker within hours. These targets are urgent, visible, time-critical. Infrastructure follows a completely different logic. A bridge is not a weapon waiting to shoot. A high-voltage line is not creeping toward your base. They are the supporting structure that every other capability depends on. Attack that structure, and you're not trying to win this week's skirmish. You are deciding whether the opponent can still wage war next quarter or rebuild the year after. That evolution, from immediate hardware to foundational systems, rarely appears in the first days of a war. It emerges later, once enough data has been gathered to identify which crossing is the real choke point, not just the one that looks large on satellite imagery. That level of insight does not come only from satellites. It comes from patiently mapping how real supply chains operate, where the actual bottlenecks lie, and which nodes feed weapons production versus household electricity. And that is where the title of this video becomes important. Because the tight focus of these strikes shows the target set was drawn up long before the first missile flew. This is not improvisation under pressure. This is a plan that waited for the right moment. So what was the moment? What did Iran actually do? Iran made the mistake of squeezing the one thing the entire world cannot live without, the Strait of Hormuz. Zoom out on the map and you see it immediately. 21 miles of water between the coast of Iran and the coast of Oman, the only sea passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Every oil tanker on the planet's most important energy route has to pass through it. Roughly a fifth of all the oil consumed on Earth moves through that channel every day, more than 20 million barrels. When Iran threatens that route, it is not threatening one country, it is threatening every country. And that is the leverage Tehran has always believed it held. The ultimate weapon of a country that knows it cannot match its enemies tank for tank, ship for ship. Close the strait and the price of oil spikes, the world economy coughs. Everyone has to pay attention. For years, Iran leaned on that lever without ever pulling it fully, because closing the strait is an act of war. It watched the oil price climb and it backed off. That was the dance. This time was different. This time, Iran did more than lean. It pressed the lever so hard that the ships in the water started reporting explosions near their hulls. Tankers began sailing with their tracking systems switched off, moving dark through the most watched waterway on Earth, hoping not to be seen. The Ghost Fleet. Every dark crossing a gamble. A ship that no one can see is a ship that no one can rescue. And here is the part that changes everything. By weaponizing the world's energy supply, Iran crossed a line that even its own defenders had trouble explaining away. The United States answered with words that were not softened. Top American leadership issued explicit warnings, reopened the Strait of Hormuz by a stated deadline, or Iran's power plants and bridges would be destroyed. Specific consequences spelled out, blunt, confrontational. And Iran's response made the mistake complete. Officials called on volunteers to form human chains around power stations. The imagery meant to say, ordinary people will die before we let these sites fall. Iranian leaders claimed millions responded. Now ask yourself what that actually accomplished. It put civilians in the frame of military targets. It converted power plants from industrial infrastructure into human shields. And it gave the other side the answer it needed to justify the campaign that had been planned for months. The infrastructure strikes that followed were not revenge. They were the execution of a plan that was waiting for the green light, and Iran just handed it to them on a map. Think about the timing. The campaign against the bridges and ports did not come first. It came after Iran's moves at Hormuz. That ordering is not an accident. When the enemy attacks the world's oil lifeline, the rules of the game change. Strikes on Iranian infrastructure stop being a hard decision and start being a response. The blame shifts, the narrative flips, and the military gets exactly what it always needs most: legitimacy. That is the mistake in one sentence. Iran handed the United States a justification it could take to the world, to its allies, and to its own public for destroying the one thing Iran needed most to survive the conflict, the infrastructure that kept it running. Now, let's look at why Iran's particular network of bridges, rails, and ports is such a critical weak point right now. Iran has lived under punishing sanctions for years. Its access to global banking, maritime insurance, and foreign capital has been systematically choked off. International sanctions are economic punishments that cut a country off from the world's financial system until it changes its behavior. When official money channels get blocked, physical routes become the only ways a country can still move commodities, fuel, and weapons without every shipment being traced and intercepted. A rail line heading north toward Central Asia is not just moving passengers, it is a commercial lifeline, one of the few corridors through which Iran can still trade with Eastern partners without relying on sea lanes that everyone is watching. A southern harbor with independent deepwater access, like the newer Chabahar facility on the Gulf of Oman, is a pressure release valve, Iran's last relatively unsupervised opening to global trade, an exit that does not require passing through the Strait of Hormuz at all. When the strikes hit both of these at roughly the same time, the southern ports and the northern rail backbone, you are not watching random dots being picked off a chart. You are watching two of Iran's main economic workarounds being squeezed simultaneously. Both safety valves tightened, both channels became less reliable. And the message was clear. Every backup path Iran imagined using if the strait became truly unusable was being closed off, one by one, until no workaround remained. Then there was the control tower itself. Iranian state outlets released imagery of that structure collapsing in what appeared to be a direct hit. The tower mattered because it was the coordination hub for the harbor, the brain that managed ship movements in and out. When the brain goes down, order gives way to confusion. Every merchant or naval vessel trying to use that approach becomes harder to monitor, harder to escort, harder to protect. The valve does not seal shut. It just stops performing its core function. Here is what deserves clear emphasis, because it can vanish behind all the strategic talk. People have been killed in these operations. Iranian sources reported that the bridge strikes in Hormozgan province left several dead and many wounded. Rail bridges near densely populated areas reportedly collapsed onto civilians who happened to be near or under them at the instant of impact. One especially noted attack on a major bridge outside Tehran, described as among the tallest in the region, reportedly killed around 10 people, with more injuries unaccounted for. Some of the victims were unmistakably non-combatants, families, commuters, workers moving through ordinary routines, communities directly beneath the story we are analyzing from far away. This is not a bloodless game of strategy. This is the human toll of decisions made thousands of kilometers from the neighborhoods that absorb the consequences. And it is both possible and necessary to hold two opposing truths in your mind at once. You can understand the military logic that put a target on a list, and you can still recognize that every one of these strikes inflicts a human price that does not disappear when the news cycle moves on. So why would leadership choose to climb this ladder, knowing the political and humanitarian fallout attached to these kinds of targets? Because the message is not primarily aimed at rank-and-file troops. It is aimed at the people who actually decide whether a war continues, the core decision-makers who care whether the economy still functions, whether the lights stay on, and whether public tolerance holds under mounting stress. A destroyed weapons depot can be replenished or bypassed quickly if the money and logistics exist. A collapsed bridge takes months. A severed rail line takes months. A crippled power plant takes even longer. And restoration demands engineers, imported materials, and substantial capital. Under Iran's current sanctions regime, those inputs are not readily available. You cannot import what you need when access to markets is strangled. You cannot hire external contractors when restrictions limit who will operate there. You cannot secure foreign credit when global banks will not process your transactions. That represents a very different level of pressure. It does not end the fighting with one spectacular blow. It grinds down. It stacks. It compounds over time. Pressure designed to work through duration, not instant shock. Now let's look at how this pressure unfolds inside a government, because it is messier than a simple surrender moment. When barracks or missile sites get hit, the reaction follows a tight script. Replace what you can, strengthen what's left, continue operations. There is a coherent sense of purpose. We were struck. We respond. We persevere. But when the target is the machinery that lets the country function day to day, the internal debate gets dangerous. Generals want to keep projecting force regardless of cost. Economic officials watch logistics collapse and start asking how many more months this is sustainable. Political leaders face increasingly angry citizens demanding answers for shuttered rail lines, routine blackouts, and spiking prices, while needing enough support to prevent internal fragmentation. That slow-spreading disagreement is exactly the kind of friction this campaign is built to trigger. The goal is not just to weaken an army. It is to make the state leadership tear itself apart under conflicting pressures from below and from inside. There is also a regional economic layer that goes underreported. When a northbound rail corridor out of Iran is disrupted, it does not only affect Tehran. It affects every downstream partner that depends on the same route. It sends a sharp signal to neighbors and trade partners that staying closely tied to Iran carries real risk, regardless of whatever diplomatic statements they keep issuing. The same applies to the ports. When a major terminal's control systems become suspect, insurers and shippers rerun their models for the whole region, not just one harbor. Vessels reroute, firms diversify, commerce shifts. These ripple effects can linger long after the fighting cools. Isolation spreads further than the blast radius of any single hit. On the diplomatic front, something else is happening that draws fewer headlines. Iranian officials frame their actions as defensive and paint the American strikes as unwarranted escalation. That framing is standard. Nearly every government claims it is only responding. The key question is not whether Iran believes its own messaging. It is whether that narrative still persuades the people it must influence at home and abroad. When it becomes visibly obvious that one side is losing the infrastructure contest, the story of pure victimhood becomes harder to sustain. And regional states have noticed. Many spent the early months hedging behind carefully worded statements. As time has passed, some have edged toward more active cooperation, sharing intelligence, aligning logistics, quietly facilitating support. When multiple parties are visibly involved, Iran's claim that it faces a one-sided onslaught starts to fall apart. Now, let's talk about how such campaigns are actually assembled, because most people imagine planners simply circling important-looking bridges on a map. In reality, the process is far more rigorous. Before firing, strategists have to answer detailed questions. If this span is removed, how many alternative paths remain? How much traffic can really be rerouted? Which industries or military functions rely on this specific corridor? How densely populated is the surrounding area compared to the military value? How long will restoration truly take? This is a completely different analytical task from eliminating a launcher sitting in the open. It demands economic insight, logistics modeling, and deep familiarity with how goods, fuel, and people actually flow through a system. This is also why modern infrastructure targeting leans on long-range precision weapons. Cruise missiles fired from aircraft, ships, or bombers well beyond the reach of remaining defenses can hit multiple nodes in a single coordinated wave without sending manned aircraft into contested skies. Combined with satellite imaging, real-time signals, and advanced guidance, you get operations that require months of preparation, even though the active strike window might be just a few hours. History provides context here. The idea of crippling a country's infrastructure is not new. Earlier wars used the same principle with far less discrimination. Wide-area bombing that flattened power and transport networks. Those older campaigns often failed to produce the desired political results, because the damage did not necessarily hit what ruling elites depended on most. Modern precision changes that equation. In theory, it allows attackers to focus on the infrastructure that sustains an enemy's military and core economy, while sparing enough civilian life to avoid the kind of devastation that rallies people behind their government. That balance is extremely difficult to maintain. And based on the casualty reports out of Iran, it has clearly not been maintained consistently. Bridges hit with people still crossing. Rail yards struck during operations. These are not abstract icons on a briefing slide. They are lived human tragedies resulting from remote decisions. So, where does all this leave the wider war? Iran has leaned on several major strategic pillars throughout this conflict. Control over Hormuz grants leverage over world shipping. A secondary southern port with independent deepwater access offers a workaround to that choke point. A rail spine to the north opens another pathway for sanctions-busting trade. And enough military and naval capacity remains to pose a credible escalation threat if its interests are cornered. This recent wave of attacks targets the second and third pillars directly. The port control systems have been hit. The rail links feeding northern commerce have been hit. Those are not random choices. They are strikes against Iran's contingency plans. On top of that, the public threats directed at power facilities introduce a fourth layer of strain, focused less on moving goods and more on whether Iran can keep functioning as a modern state at all. If the grid falters, industry stalls. If industry stalls, public patience cracks further. And it all comes back to the mistake. Iran's own escalation at Hormuz is what made this escalation possible. It converted a defensive war into an economic siege, and it handed the other side the moral high ground it had been preparing for months. The tragedy is that Iran believed it was holding a gun to the world's head. It did not see that it was standing inside a target that the world's most powerful military had already mapped, measured, and modeled down to the last railway switch. Let's be honest about what history suggests. Sanctions and infrastructure pressure almost never produce one dramatic breaking point that everyone recognizes in real time. They generate a slow buildup of damage that becomes harder and harder to manage quietly. That hidden buildup eventually forces shifts in behavior that looks sudden from the outside, even though they were forming for months beneath the surface. Whether this war is on that trajectory is still genuinely uncertain, but the latest targeting patterns point in exactly that direction. So what should you watch if you want to understand where this is really going? Pay attention to how quickly damaged bridges and rail lines are restored, or whether they stay out of service for long stretches. Listen for any subtle change in Iran's tone, toward harder escalation or tentative flexibility. Track whether regional partners keep stepping back from economic ties or begin drifting back to normal engagement. And watch for real diplomatic motion instead of the same talking points, recycled by both sides. The deeper question is the one this whole story has been circling. How much pressure can a leadership absorb before its actual decisions change? Not the announcements crafted for public consumption, but the difficult conversations in secure rooms, where finance officials, commanders, and politicians are all pushing in different directions because the ground beneath their state is steadily eroding. Past experience suggests the answer is seldom a single dramatic turning point. It is a slow, uncomfortable buildup that eventually crosses a threshold that looks sudden but has been forming for a long time. Whether this infrastructure campaign truly changes Iran's calculations, or simply becomes another phase it absorbs, as it has absorbed every previous escalation, is something we will only understand by watching closely in the months ahead. There will be no neat cinematic ending. But one thing is already certain. Iran's decision to squeeze the Strait of Hormuz was supposed to make the world blink. Instead, it gave the American military the opening it had been waiting for, and the war moved off the missile map and onto the map of everyday life. Bridges, rails, power lines, water. The things a country needs just to exist. And that is a war you can see coming from the moment a single human chain forms around a power station, because it means the other side has already found its excuse. Keep watching. Because the next mistake will not be announced. It will just show up on the map.